I'm starting the recording, so welcome everybody. This is the Monday, January 27th, 2020 SIG Release meeting. Somewhat amazingly, we have nothing on our agenda formally today in terms of things that people put in, but we do have a standing set of stuff we would typically go through. The first subproject that we would talk about is the licensing subproject, and I'm not sure if anybody from that is here today. I don't see Stephen. All right, we will just carry on to release engineering. I know there's been a lot going on in release engineering the last little while. I want to just open the floor. Is there anything that folks want to talk about that's been going on just lately?
I think the only question I had was I saw a lot of the chat around Inago and just was curious if there were any updates there or if it was just kind of that, we're going to deprecate that and move on to something else.
Yeah, we haven't had a meeting probably since we really got to the bottom of what was going on there. And I wouldn't say we have it resolved. So Inago is a couple thousand lines of bash for anybody who isn't familiar. It's very interesting bash. It's probably some of the most beautifully complex bash I've ever seen, or actually just straight definitely is the most complex bash I've ever seen. It's got a top level set of loops that run across a list of tasks that need accomplished for the release. And it loops across them, sort of calling these functions or sometimes skipping some functions. So you've got what one might normally think of as a list of things that need done to make a release. And rather than doing one, and if it succeeded, moving on to the next, if it succeeded, moving on to the next, the top level control logic is structured that it goes across all of them and potentially fires a bunch of functions to start them working on the things. There's some problems though in that the things are somewhat dependent. A normal build and release process, you have a series of events because one event builds on top of the prior event, or you sort of have output and input criteria, and successful output of one phase leads to input criteria being met for the next phase. Code isn't structured this way. That makes it a little tricky to debug. So you have a set of things that speculatively get started, and some of them get skipped because they're known to be dependent on other things, so they get left for a later loop that calls all of the things again and tries to make up for things that it got skipped earlier. And the way that this works is that the code is designed or is intended to be, perhaps modulo some bugs, to be stateful and reentrant. So you can call the same function that does a particular task. Like there's a function that will tag the repo. It might get called 3 or 4 times. Obviously, we can't apply the same tags multiple times, so the function looks to see if for its set of arguments, the stuff is already seeming done, and if so, it'll bail out. So instead of a linear flow, you have this weird sort of, it's almost like a search algorithm in a way. It's quite fascinating. And then to make things ever so slightly more complicated, some of those things also have parallelism. So bash is firing things in the background and potentially waiting. In addition to things being stateful and being sort of cleaned up later with subsequent runs, some things also fire things in parallel and wait. So you have this really complicated set of code that maybe never quite runs the same twice, depending on the state it's running against. Very, very difficult to debug. Now, it turns out that the code that's looping across some of the things that need done is not looping across a list of actions or a list of things that need acted upon in terms of state variables, but an associative array. And it traverses them as if it's going to deal with them linearly, and it has a built-in assumption that they are in a particular order. So for example, we have a set of strings. We might be doing a alpha release, a beta release, an RC release, or an official release. Those strings aren't in alphabetical order. In an associative array, who knows what order they're in? But the code was written to an assumption about how bash less than or equal to version 4 gives you the output of an associative array if you loop across all of the keys. This fall, we changed the underlying container for our build to a newer one because what we were using was ancient and probably had a gazillion CVEs, and we should have a clean build stage when we work, right? Makes sense. Well, under that, Bash 4 changed to Bash 5 because Bash 5 is the latest Bash. And our associative arrays started being traversed in a different order because this is something you never depend on in computer science. So of course, Bash changed the order because nobody would have ever depended on a fixed order there. And now our code that already was kind of difficult to debug and running in funky orders is running in a wildly unexpected order of events and doing the tagging, building, releasing out of order. So we got to the bottom of that. We fixed the associative array. We made sure that things, if you walk across it, you get an ordered list that treats alphas as something that happened before betas, which are something that happened before RCs, which are something that happened before official. So we have code that, regardless of the order, make sure that we're doing those things in that order. So that only took like a month for us to get to the bottom of. So we have it minimally worked around in the code, but what Stephen and I were discussing last week, and I was curious to see if he'd been here, if he was going to go ahead and do it, or if maybe somebody else could start working on it, was whether we could unroll those top level loops, and instead of calling things somewhat randomly in order, that we call them once in the order with the specific fixed arguments that we want. Initially, this would lead to some duplication of code because instead of one beautiful generic function, you have a couple specific ones that do just the parts that are necessary for alpha or for beta or official release and so on. But it would make the code readable and understandable. And where this is useful is and Hannes says on the Zoom chat, and run them in separate GCB jobs. Yeah, so if we decompose this, instead of being one large thing that's stateful based on a whole bunch of global bash variables, we could have a series of things that are working with known inputs and outputs, and each of them could be separate tools eventually. So maybe not even duplicated code, but specialized, focused code. And then all of those things could run in separate jobs, and we have like a more short running thing where we can get the output from it and look at it. And if it's buggy, we could iterate on just that part instead of the whole build being one monolithic thing. And each of those little things could be unit testable as well. So that's kind of the high level thinking. Originally, we weren't going to do this because the Anago code was so scary. We thought, let's just define what we want our order events to be and implement this clean and move forward. But with this bug, we've had to dive into it more than we intended. And then Lubomir Ivanov on the call today from SIG Cluster Lifecycle, he's put forward a KEP to move kubeadm out of the KK repo into its own repo. And then it still needs released in conjunction with the other KK code, kubelit, for example, and kubectl and the API server. And initially the intent is to version them the same as well. So it makes sense to try and reuse our existing build and release code because the set of stuff that kubeadm has for build and release requirements is no different than when it was in KK. And in theory, our code in SIG Release covers that use case. In practice, it's really, really difficult. But if we got this little bit of cleaning up at the top level control logic in Anago, it would make it easier for us to insert some tweaks that allowed us to also build kubeadm in a predictable way. So maybe I'll pause there. We can still, I want to still go into more detail on the kubeadm stuff, but is that useful context on Anago? Have I scared everybody away?
No, thank you. That was very helpful, and I like that full description too. It kind of helps me wrap my head around the bash fire, or so it was described a few times.
So kubeadm, Lubomir, is there other stuff that you'd like to chat with us about? I know with the KEP, we've had a fair amount of back and forth in the KEP around how or what we might do, but this would be a great place to talk about it, get other people's thoughts and ideas.
Yeah, so if you have the time, please review my final amendments to the KEP. Ideally, we should merge it today. I also asked Fabrizio from SIG Cluster Lifecycle to take a look. So I think we had plenty of discussion on that cap. Something that I started considering like last minute is maybe we can start building kubeadm from the KK repository instead of from Anago, because the tools that prepare tarballs are already in KK. Also, the image building tools are in KK. So Anago is just executing this process of calling make release on the KK clone, the KK repository clone. And from there, it pushes artifacts to Google buckets. It feels to me like right now, with our current setup of building and releasing Kubernetes, the better place to build an external artifact seems to be KK and not from Anago. What do you think?
So the way I've thought about this is what is the final goal and on what timeline? So, and then kind of compare that against where we are, because we know we have Anago and we know we've been working on something for a replacement, but Anago, we have it, it works in sort of weak air quotes, and the replacement that we're working on is coming along, hopefully to be in a fair amount better state this release. But if the kubeadm work is intended to be done in this cycle, then that time boxes things a lot. I wouldn't trust that our replacement for Anago is ready in time to depend on for kubeadm. I think there would be some risk there in knowing that it would truly be done, and that the two wouldn't, with one thing planned and another thing proposed, that oversubscribes potentially. So I worry about the risk of missing on that target date. So that has me then backing up to like, well, could we do something minimal in Anago? The alternative to not doing it in Anago, if you're building and pushing things through some other mechanism. So say you have a prow job and your own GCB jobs, maybe whatever it is, you build and release somehow, the outputs end up in some GCB buckets. We'd still have to tweak Anago so that the official build contained the relevant bits, because it's doing the monolithic sort of tarballs for all of the bits of stuff. So unless kubeadm were to leave those, which I think would be a confusing sudden change to downstream users, we'd still need to tweak some of Anago in that way.
Unless the built-in KK that clones the kubeadm repo, builds the kubeadm artifact, maybe the same process can just place the kubeadm binary in the same output location, and
that's a possibility, yeah.
From there, all the tools are supposed to just work the way they are currently.
That has the plus of being a good sort of transition for somebody who's used to having KK and building and getting a kubeadm output. They would still have that, even if they hadn't been paying attention and known that kubeadm moves somewhere else.
Yeah, I added this proposal as part of the alternatives in the KEP, but I'm willing to send a proof of concept PR at some point, and we don't have to merge it for KK. We can just see feedback from others on this. And if they ask like, hey, where is this originated from? We can just point them to the KEP as an alternative approach. But honestly, I'm trying to say here that maybe I'm going to send the alternative, quote unquote, alternative PR first.
Where would you do tagging? Would you still just look to a prow job and something under your control to notice that KK had been branched or tagged?
Yes, possibly an external process. External, looking at the KK build and the Anago tool as well. External to those, so like a separate process. Maybe manual, maybe automatic, but most likely automatic based on a proud job.
Yeah, so again, kind of thinking about timeline and not wanting to to have redundant effort. That does add a third variation. None of us are, I don't think anybody's excited about changing or modifying Anago, especially as we're trying to get away from it, but this has the benefit of, at least if it's changing and modifying something else, it might smooth things for the end user. It could also result in things that are reusable as we shift away from Anago.
Yes. I think what we should start doing, like maybe an actionable item from that KEP, like the first item, is to send an email to KDEF and see that if we have any users of the CI deps and RPMs that are currently being generated from KK. Maybe some of you are familiar with that. We generate from the Kubernetes repository using Bazel deps and RPMs that are supposedly uploaded to our CI buckets, but we don't have evidence of any potential users there. So I'm willing to send a mail to gather feedback from the community. And then if nobody replies, we can just send a PR for that to remove them. And maybe in the future, like I outlined in the KEP this already, we can consolidate the CI builds and release builds of deps and RPMs in the same place. Make potentially K release as the repository for that.
That makes sense to me. I suppose you also probably like it because it means it's under your control. Like as we start to whittle out what dependencies and funkiness there is in certain places, like it's logical to think initially, like we'll just use what SIG Release does, we'll reuse that, and then, oh, it's not everything we might have hoped it would be, so it's hard to reuse. This gives you the ability to get just what you need.
Yeah, and also the deps and RPMs, if they are at the same repository, potentially they can use the same specs because currently we have different specs. And the specs tend to drift for the packages between KK and K release. In terms of owning, I guess my original question when I joined the project is why do we even have deps and RPMs in the first place? But then I realized that this is like what people go for when they want to install the basic packages like kubectl. Actually, kubectl, most people just download it as a binary, but kubelet, kubeadm, they prefer using packages because they pull some extra dependencies. And I realized the benefits from using packages. So nowadays, I'm starting to understand, I prefer that we have packages. In terms of the maintenance aspect, this has been this issue where sequence lifecycle does not maintain properly the deps and RPMs. So now SIG Release maintain them. But I think in the future, there should be a better communication. And maybe if SIG Release can potentially also give ownership in some folders where the specs are, these topics need discussion.
Yeah, I also have wondered why we make them. I get why in a lot of scenarios, at least some of the parts, especially as it gets into things that are tying into other dependencies in the host's OS, using the host OS's native package manager makes it easier to get those dependencies. The alternatives being just sort of documented and leave it to the user to get all of the things that they want, or us putting in an opinionated way all of it in a container. All of those have downsides. The path that things are on right now from a SIG release perspective is to commonize onto a Go-based tool the building. Sasha, is there anything that you would want to share with Lubomir about that, like the high-level thinking and progress where it's going?
So my first question would be, how do we want to start and when? So we are currently in a progress where we can already, for example, generate a changelog for the patch releases and also for the minor releases. But we have to come to a point where we actually use it in production. And we should create a timeline for that, I think so, and then try it out. Also regarding the testing repository we want to set up and stuff like that.
This is about the tool that is responsible for package creation?
Yes, and also some other tasks like changelog generation and publishing the artifacts and everything which runs in GCP, basically.
I see. So these are going to be the responsibility of a single tool?
Yes, a single tool which is split into multiple smaller tools.
Yes, multiple binaries really make more sense for this, it feels like.
Oh yeah. We created some packages around it that we can reuse it over the same tools.
I think something that the future tools or maybe the work that is currently ongoing has to be prescient about is that a lot more projects are going to split from Kubernetes. So if you make the tools reusable, for instance, if you have a release notes tool and the kubeadm project can use the same release notes tool, you know, for us to like even check if our release log looks fine, this is going to be beneficial. Because the current problem that I see with Anago is that it's binded to the Kubernetes repository, and there's no way to change that. So I think our tools have to be flexible in terms of supporting these multiple repositories.
I would prefer if we were more flexible than that, that we designed for an assumption that the org name, the repo name, and the branch names are all variables. The benefit to doing this is that then me as an individual contributor, I can run the official tool against github.com/tpepper/Kubernetes branch. Crazy idea. And it should be expected to work. As long as we have built-in assumptions around branch naming and org naming, we sort of get ourselves into a position where we can only build against the official things. We can only build if we're official people in the project. And that thinking, I think, is what led to the proposal that we build these test repos under the Kubernetes org. If that's the only way we can do things in the short term, I mean, I guess I'm okay with it, but I think long term that makes our life harder, and we should be thinking about ways to make it easier for other people to run this code, test it, and participate in its development, as opposed to it only being a core set of people who've gone through a fairly long contributor ladder progression to get to the point where they're known and trusted to run the official tools, since that's the only way we're able to run them currently.
Yeah. Also,
and Sasha mentions in so the stuff around refactoring Bash to Go tools, the umbrella issue is Kubernetes/release issue number 918, just for anybody following along on the video.
Yes, I'm already watching this particular ticket. So I really am looking forward to the proposal from Stephen getting merged, where I guess this needs a SIG architecture discussion, where we need a testing repositories or multiple testing repositories where we can clone Kubernetes and experiment with tagging and basically creating branches, things like that. I think it's very important to have this. I'm like quite surprised we don't have this yet in the project. This is really pending, so I encourage you guys to join the SIG architecture meeting, like get a stamp and get this going, because it's rather important.
I'm curious to see what architecture thinks. I see this being a potentially slippery slope, kind of like I mentioned, the potentially everything needs a secondary shadow repo upon which to experiment, and that's not a great pattern. And part of the reason we may not have that is an assumption, as with other open source projects, that it's possible to run the project CI on your own fork of the project. I think we've repeatedly built down a path to where that's effectively impossible today. But I don't know in the early days of the project if that was just sort of happenstance or if it was design intent or what. But I think I worry that we're just repeating that pattern by going further into the other repos.
Yes, I agree. The tools should support custom branches, custom repositories. And one of the tools that already supports that is the cherry pick tool. I was surprised that I was originally thinking that it does not support custom repositories, custom forks, custom remotes, but actually it does. You can set up everything, and you can actually fork. You can actually send a cherry pick to your own fork, so it works.
That's really useful for testing. I knew it had to, at least on the input side, because potentially it's coming from some arbitrary place, but the target isn't also presumed to be KK release branches is really useful.
Yes, it works on the principle of targeting remotes. So you can set up your remotes and locally on your clone, and then when you execute the tool, you can pass the remotes that you want to use, and it just works. And I think potential testing on the user side for our build process should be done in a similar way. So when you dry run a build, you can actually, instead of dry running a Kubernetes build, you can run an actual build from your fork of Kubernetes. And this gives the possibility for pretty much everyone to test the Kubernetes build, not just the current release manager. This is very powerful.
Sasha, what are your thoughts on that?
I'm really in favor of that. Yeah, the question is, how do we want to transfer Energo into a Golang-based tool? So, do we want to do it in one rush, or do we want to replace parts of Energo and put some Go code in? It would be possible. I tried it out last week, but as you already mentioned, the complexity of the script is so high that it's really possible that I break something up then, and this would affect every release, which is really a bad thing. So I would be in favor of rewriting the tool from scratch, which is a higher effort and costs more implementation efforts on our engineering side. But I think it's also in relation to testing the proper way to do it.
I agree, especially on in relation to the testing front. I do think if we have point tools that are well tested and demonstrated to behave in the way we expect them, to replace a function call whose implementation is a bunch of bash with the same name function call that just shells out to run the go command, I would like to think that that would be something we could do safely with Anago. The problem again there is testing. So that leaves us between now and the 1.18 release. We have a few points during which we could do beta releases and get some sense of whether those small changes were effective and start moving forward with not just saying that something's deprecated, but actually removing that bash code. I like that idea in that it means we're demonstrating some forward progress and we're simplifying Anago with things that we now know and understand. I fear that the monolithic switchover is going to take more time than we're imagining. That's why I kind of like the incremental approach. The But yeah, it's a tricky trade-off. I think based on kind of the last 6 to 12 months of discussing change and starting to get going on change and thinking like, let's just dive in and do it and get it switched over and time flowing by, I'm starting to lean much more towards the incremental approach just to be moving forward. I don't see the clear acceptance criteria if we're doing it completely by scratch, having been safely and fully met to where we confidently switch over in the next release or two, where it becomes easier maybe if most of Anago has disappeared to say like, let's just get the rest of it now.
I mean, for the changelog, for example, we already could do it. So I could prepare a PR where we replace the rel nodes bash script with the changelog crel subcommand, and this should work. But at the point where we, yeah, where we actually bring it into the master, then it has to work forever. So, and I'm not sure if this, how we can test this. So.
I'm not too worried about that one. Like it's unit testable on its own, right? Like you keep updating your GitHub issues and showing like, here's the new output. Like you are showing that anybody and any of us can run it and see the output and understand it. Like I'm comfortable with that. It's something that we don't have, or we didn't have as much, and it sets that precedent for saying like, this is the type of thing we want for stuff that goes into Anago, and maybe Anago then starts to become just sort of this top level control logic shell. Even though already I said, like, let's get rid of the top level control logic too. Like that part needs to go and be dramatically simplified. But I see a viable path towards doing this piecemeal. And for something like the changelog part, being able to do that with confidence. Based on the bugs we found over the last while, I think we've done some simplifying to the tagging part, and that could be made simpler yet. And I can see kind of decomposing it this way as viable. And the things that then become prerequisites to other things, like packaging's pretty far out there compared to tagging, and yeah. One of the things Lumira and I talked about quite a bit in the KEP issue for KubeADM is actually that tagging. Right now, one of the things that we discovered as we were looking through Anago and trying to debug, I've never actually looked too closely at what we get out of the tool, but basically forever, because of a chicken and egg problem, the tool has tagged the repo, and then based on that tag-ish, has started doing things. One of the things that it does is build the changelog, because we want to, if we're building, say, 1.18.0, we want to build the changelog for 1.18.0. What is 1.18.0? Well, it's the stuff up to the tag. But that means that every one of our tags, the corresponding changelog comes after the tag in the history. And unless you build from something other than the tag or some commits after tag, you don't actually have the changelog in the release. So there's a few little things like that. Like Lubomir had called out, like, well, we don't want to tag KubeADM until KK has been tagged. In theory, you could think of them as independent. Whenever KubeADM is ready to release, they could tag, but then you've got to have some sort of handshaking, and who goes first, who blocks who if they're not ready, is a bit of an issue there. But I'm curious what people have for thoughts. I have some ideas maybe on other ways that we could go about tagging and declaring build version strings, but I'm curious what other people's thoughts are on that general problem.
It feels to me like we need this generic mechanic of automatically tagging and branching other repositories based on KK. And this is now pressing for the KubeADM project, but I'm pretty sure we're going to need it for other projects too. And I saw a comment by Michelle Ayu from Google, who is a tech lead for SIG storage, and they have something similar in mind for one of their repositories. They want to tag and branch their repositories similar to KK, but they don't want to use staging. And to clarify here, staging is something that the so-called publishing bot can automate. So if you add your repository as part of staging, the publishing bot can pick your changes and publish them to a remote repository by also branching and tagging this remote repository. But SIG storage, similarly to kubeadm, does not want to do that. They want this external process of branching and tagging. And I'm going to start experimenting pretty soon on this area by creating the so-called post-submit job. So the idea is to create a prow post-submit job. So every time KK creates a new branch or new tag, the post-submit job is going to trigger, collect a list of tags and branches that are not present on a certain remote repository and create them. So maybe in the future, this same process can be used for a list of repositories instead of only the kubeadm repository. But this was my experimental idea after discussing with the prow maintainers, who said that I don't need a prow plugin for that or something else. They said that you can do this with a post-submit job at this point. But this is, I think the future is going to demand this type of process in our organizations. GitHub.
What are your thoughts, though, on things like the changelog or other artifacts that are tied to the release version? Would you prefer those to be in the repo before the repo is tagged at that version, or are you okay with them being afterwards?
So
consider the case where we've gotten out of sync somehow, and you've got 3 releases on KK that have just happened, and those branches and the tags need mirrored over to kubeadm. What would be the order? Obviously, you create the branches. Do you populate 3 changelogs, tag them all? Do you populate a changelog, tag it, populate a changelog, tag it, populate a changelog, tag it? Or make the 3 tags just as you make the branch and then add 3 changelogs after? Like, what would you expect as a logical ordering of events there, so that somebody looking at the Git repo would see content at a commit basis and at a tag basis that was logical?
First of all, I think that the out of sync scenario should not be allowed to happen. So we should try to prevent that. Because the same way.
I agree, but I think that they will always happen at unexpected times, where unexpected time is maybe 3 years from now when none of us are around to say, oh, we should have done what we thought we had about doing. Like in the future, when this breaks, the people who have thought about it or foresaw it aren't going to be around. So somebody's going to be puzzling over it and stuck.
Sure, but if in 3 years' time I see the kubeadm project having this problem, for instance, I would consider the kubeadm project unmaintained at this point. So maybe we should move it to a sunset organization or something like that. My point is that the publishing bot right now currently does not allow this scenario to happen. If it happens, it triggers multiple people like Dims, Nikita immediately trying to fix the problem. I think we should try.
It's been stuck for days or maybe even as much as a week where it wasn't publishing. And if for some reason we were still releasing on the KK side, say we had just released but then got a new surprise CVE, I think it's, in any week, it's relatively likely that this could happen.
But if it happens for a short period of time, people can still manually tag and branch, which is always a solution. I think the problem happens.
So if you manually tag and branch, what would be your order? You'd branch and then would you commit the changelog and tag, or would you branch and then tag and commit the changelog?
I personally think that we should not include change walks in maybe in the sub-repositories, these kubeadm, maybe in the kubelet, the kubectl repositories. I'm not convinced that we need change walks for those if they are part of the official release. This seems really like a detail that we can clarify in the future, like see how it goes. So I cannot give you an exact order right now. I would first branch, possibly then tag, but the changelog, I don't see it in the picture for now.
What do other people think? Am I being too pedantic? Should I not care if what we release is different than what's tagged? Like, what are other experiences in terms of release and reproducibility? If we've never had this in the project yet, because like this is a known bug in Anago or a known non-design point that never got resolved yet, is it too aspirational to want to do more?
I was thinking that the future extensions of the Creo sub tool responsible, I think we already have a separate tool for release walks anyway. I believe Mark Rapaya wrote that last year or a couple of years ago. So this separate tool can also be used to gather release walk changes from other repositories. So it can consolidate one big change walk for KK, but also for the other repositories, like KubeADM, potentially kubectl. And the creation of the change walk could be a single step. This is one of the ways it's possible to create a change walk. The other way, is to individual projects writing change walk in each of these repositories. I think this is also a good way, but it's still not clear what is the best way to proceed. I think I'm in favor of the first option I said. The release tool having the potential to pick any arbitrary repository and collect the same labels and basically create a subsection with a certain project. Like, hey, these are all the KubeADM changes that we saw in this cycle. Some projects like kubectl maybe are not even going to have a change walk that is bound to the Kubernetes release cycle. So it might not be appropriate for some projects to use this tool, but maybe the kubelet is going to be bound to the Kubernetes release because it's quite core, quite essential. So maybe we're going to have a section with kubelet changes in the change walk being gathered from the kubelet repository that we maybe one day have in the future. This allows us to not have this potential drift between the styling of the changelog's. Like if it's the same changelog tool and the same basically version of the tool, we can generate the consistent changelog for the whole project. But if KubeADM decides to maybe fork the release tool and do its own changelog, then we are going to have this maybe difference in styles or maybe bugs, I don't know.
Thoughts from others? All right, I'm going to move on to the next thing on the agenda, which is just to get a readout on release team related things for the for this forum, since it is different than the release team meeting and only happens every couple of weeks. Is there anything important that SIG Release should know about status on 1.18 release? Who do we have today from the release team? Anybody?
I think they left. They were very bored by our discussion and they left.
All right, well, they're meeting in 12 minutes. So if anybody who's on the call right now wants to get an update on 118, that meeting is about to happen. Anybody on the video who was looking at SIG release and is curious about how the specific 118 release is moving along, that will also be uploaded to video to YouTube, the video from the meeting that's going to happen in a little bit here. So that's where you would find out about that. Open discussion. Somebody put a link to SIG Release 966. I'm not sure who that was. If it was you and you're on the line, do you want to talk about it? Maybe it was Steven, since it was his issue. So the CI signal subproject is an idea to break yet another thing out of the release team. So we've had a problem perceived, at least, around continuity, where each quarter when we make a new release, the release team turns over, new people get involved, and there's not perhaps continuity between those. In reality, we have people who are shadows and leads, and there's sort of a progression, and people do hang around, so there is some continuity and knowledge transfer there. But by making a formal sub-project of SIG release, monitoring CI signal means that we can have some more continuity, maybe more breadth to the team than what would just be the release team's members and leads and shadows, and run it in a bigger way. And then maybe with that additional set of hands and eyes involved, we start making a bigger impact by highlighting issues, whether it's just a flaky test or a genuinely failing test that people in the project more broadly haven't been able to key into because of the amount of noise in test results. So that's the general thinking there. It's a RFC at this point, and the issue, it's Kubernetes SIG release issue number 966. And I'll link it also or it is linked in the minutes. But if anybody has thoughts or ideas there, it would be great to comment on the issue in GitHub. All right, well, anything else folks want to talk about? We have a couple minutes, otherwise we could give people a break who are also going to be going to the SIG release meeting in a little bit. Going once. Going twice. All right, well, happy Monday, everybody. This meeting recording will be up on YouTube probably a little bit later today. Have a good one, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.